Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 51. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today's podcast, we're going to be looking at some evidence from astronomy that the Earth and the universe is not nearly as old as it is often claimed to be. And much of this is the work of Dr. Jason Lisle, who has done a lot of interesting work in this area. And I recently came across a video of his that you can kind of see on the screen here from the people over at Answers in Genesis. He gave a talk in which he had really four main points. The first point was that if you look at astronomy, that you see it declare the glory of God, which is something we see throughout the Bible. The second thing is that he showed that there are many things in astronomy that you can learn from a basic course in astronomy that are confirmed in the scripture, that the Bible never contradicts any of these basic ideas that we know of from astronomy. The third thing is that what we see in astronomy, in science, confirms the age of the cosmos as given from the Bible. Often what you see is that there are people who would consider themselves what's called old earth creationists. And an old earth creationist doesn't really go along with the biblical timeline, but instead they would go with the timeline that is much longer. And they would say that the evidence points to a longer timeline for the age of the cosmos on the order of millions and billions of years rather than on the order of thousands of years. And so we want to look really primarily at that today. But I just want to mention that idea. And then the fourth idea is that the Earth is uniquely fitted for life. You've probably heard recently about the plans of SpaceX to colonize Mars, that Elon Musk has really been big on this. This is one of the driving forces behind the company that he's built, is to colonize Mars. When you have ideas like this, when you have people that are pushing for this, it's very popular to think about the idea of the Earth being where we are currently living as humans, but we need to be a multi-planet species, is often what is said by those who advocate for going to Mars and colonizing Mars. But if you understand that the Earth is uniquely fitted for life, that God made the Earth for us to live on, then you understand that going to live on Mars or going to live on some other planet or to live on the moon or whatever the case is, that these are not going to be viable, that it's not going to work. But if you do not operate under that worldview, then it sounds like a great thing to go and colonize Mars and to go live on Mars and to do all of the things that people are saying they want to do, to go to Mars and live there, rather than just taking all of that energy and all of that effort and using it here on Earth to make the Earth a much better and more habitable place. It is a curious thing to me. But if you don't have the same worldview as I do, I cannot expect you to come to the same conclusions as I do. It seems to me that you could take all of those resources and all of that effort and look at the Earth and say, hey, let's make it an even better place to live, because Mars is currently not a place where, as humans, we would be able to survive without having spacesuits and having all of this infrastructure. Here on Earth, we don't need all of that. You can breathe air outside, you can walk, you have the benefit of the sun. Our bodies are such that we thrive here on Earth. So to go somewhere else only makes sense if you don't understand the Earth to be uniquely fitted for life. And if you think that maybe there are these other places out there where we could live and that we could become this multi-planetary species, as is said. So when we're talking about all of these things, worldview is important. So as a believer in Jesus Christ and a believer in the Bible as God's scripture, then there's a difference between how I'm going to approach things and how someone else is. Now, there are people that will say that because I believe in God and the Bible, that makes me less of a scientist than someone who, or less of an engineer than someone who doesn't believe those things. But again, that's just philosophy. That's rhetoric. It's not actually something that we can look at and nail down as truth. And as we've pointed out on multiple occasions, those who originated modern science were all believers. So I could as easily say to those who are atheistic, well, if you don't have a biblical worldview, you cannot do good science. Now, I don't say that. I think you are especially vulnerable to pseudoscience when you do not acknowledge the God of the universe, the God that made all of this. You're going to be more susceptible to believing ideas that are false, like evolution, like Big Bang, like abiogenesis. These are ideas that are anti-scientific, they are pseudoscientific, but you're more vulnerable to them when you're atheistic because it goes along with the worldview that you want to believe. Now, it's also possible that I'm more vulnerable to certain things, and we're going to talk about the anisotropic synchrony convention today. If you don't know what that is, we'll talk a little bit about it. It's possible that when I look at an idea like that I'm more vulnerable to an idea like that, which could potentially be false or it could be not true scientifically. I might be more vulnerable to believing that because it actually aligns, and the originator of that idea is someone who subscribes to the biblical worldview. So it's true. We all have biases. And so it's very important for us to understand what those are and put them on the table up front, rather than saying, as long as I don't have a biblical worldview, then I can do good science. And that's what often is said. That isn't true. So what we're going to talk about today is one of the things that he mentioned in this video, and I'll have this video linked in the video description. But I want to talk about a couple of articles that Dr. Jason Lisle wrote, and they come from 2022. So the first article he wrote is from January 21st of 2022. The second article that he wrote is from later that year. It's September of 2022, and it's this one right here, and we'll come to it later. But if we go back to the article from January 21st, 2022, where he describes the deployment of the James Webb Space Telescope. This was a big deal. Now, again, as a robotics engineer, I don't care as much about the astronomy stuff, but it is important when we're talking about age of the Earth. It's important to have some understanding of the astronomy and to have some understanding that, as Dr. Lisle points out, astronomy doesn't have to be atheistic, and it doesn't have to be something where you have to believe these certain conventions that may inherently have some materialism baked in, some Big Bang ideas baked into them. There are other conventions that you can use that are equally viable. So that's what we're going to kind of be talking about here. But when you look at the James Webb Space Telescope, often what happens is there's a great deal of money, effort, time, and scientific and engineering know-how put into wanting to learn more about the cosmos. And that's a great thing. But what we want to do is actually learn more about the cosmos. And when we gather information, use that to come to a better understanding of the cosmos, of the universe. But one of the things that Dr. Lisle points out is that as a creationist, there are certain things that he predicted about what the James Webb Space Telescope would find. Now, this is important because often those who believe in the creation accounts of the book of Genesis are said to be anti-scientific, pseudoscientific people who never really make scientific predictions that can be tested. We're just people that just say things that we believe, and there's no hard science behind it. And so one of the things Dr. Lisle did in this article from January 21st, 2022, is he said, let me give you some things that I expect to happen, some observations that I expect us to come across when the James Webb Space Telescope, when pictures come back from it. I expect these certain things to be the case. Whereas those who do not have the same worldview as I do, they're going to expect something completely different. And then when the information comes back, when the pictures come back, then we can kind of say, hey, whose worldview, whose predictions are closer to being correct? So this is really interesting because you have a real case of, we're going to get this information back from this telescope. whose predictions of what we would find that are based on creation versus evolution or versus Big Bang, let's say, cosmology, who is going to have predictions that come true? Now, what Dr. Lisle does that's interesting in this article is he not only gives his predictions of what he thought would happen. Again, we're seeing it here. It's January 21st of 2022. So they hadn't gotten anything back from the telescope yet. So we have this stuff time-stamped. He has receipts here. What he does is he says, I'm going to tell you what I think we're going to find based on my worldview and what I think they would say we would find. And I'm going to tell you what they would say when it doesn't turn out the way they expected it to. Now, this is really interesting because he's saying, I have such confidence that it's going to be as I say because I understand how this works. And then when it is as I say, this is what they're going to say to counteract the fact that it didn't happen according to their expectations. So let me show you this in the article. So and again, I'll link the articles in the description as well. So this is a $10 billion James Webb Space Telescope. It's on its way to what's called the Earth-Sun L2 Lagrangian point. If you're familiar with astronomy, I know a little bit. A Lagrangian point is basically a point at which you can put a telescope or a satellite and it won't move because gravitationally it's between two large, massive places. And so the pull of each place, if you put the object in the right spot, then there's zero pull from both locations. I think he has a picture of it down here somewhere, and that might be in it. Okay, here we go. So if you take the sun, which is kind of in the middle of this image, and you take the Earth, which is to the right, and you have the moon also orbiting the Earth, there are certain points at which if you put something in that point, it won't move, because if you calculate everything correctly, where the Earth is, where the sun is, if you put it in that place, then the pull of the Earth and the sun is such that it won't actually move that object at all. Whereas if you put it anywhere else, it's going to move around and you won't be able to, you'll have to expend energy to keep it in a certain location. So if you can find that Lagrangian point, put your object there, now it's not going to move. So that's what it's referring to when it's talking about the Lagrangian point there. Okay, so predictions. So he has a section in this article, again, from January of 2022, before they got anything back from the James Webb Space Telescope. There's a section where he says predictions, and he says here, what kind of discoveries should we expect? Among other things, the JWST, the James Webb Space Telescope, is optimized to peer as far into space as is possible with current technology. It later says, he later says in the next paragraph, first, will the JWST really be looking back in time? In the standard secular view, the light takes time to get from a distant location to us, and therefore what we see today in space actually happened a long time ago. But since the speed of light in only one direction, such as the star to the Earth, cannot be objectively measured, such a position is not provable. It is instead stipulated. Now, this is where we get into these conventions. And I've read, Dr. Lisle has a book that describes what he calls the anisotropic synchrony convention, which is his answer to this idea of the Einstein synchrony convention. The Einstein synchrony convention essentially says that the speed of light is the same in all directions. And if the speed of light is the same in all directions, then when you see something that is many, many light years away, then if you see light from that, then if the light has to travel that distance and the distance is way farther than however many light years. And by the way, a light year is not a time, it is the distance that light could travel in a year, and it's several trillion miles. So it's a really long distance. But there are things that are farther away than that. So if there are things that are farther away than that, and if there are things that are farther away than several thousand light years, then you see what Dr. Lisle calls the distant starlight problem for believers. You see, let's say that something is millions of light years away, meaning it's so far away that if light travels at its current speeds that we know it to travel at, a round trip, let's say, because we can't actually measure light going in one direction. We can only measure how long it takes light to go somewhere and bounce and come back. That's what we can actually measure experimentally. What he's saying is we can't actually measure the speed of light in one direction. We can only measure how fast it takes light to get somewhere and come back. So since we can't actually measure how fast light goes in one direction, we have to assume its speed. If we assume that its speed is the same as the round trip speed, again, this is not my field, but this is what I understand from his book. If we take it to be whatever that speed is, I remember in engineering school, we would use the speed of light to be, I believe, 3 million meters per second. Let me see if I can just look that up really quick. What is the speed of light? Yeah, so we would generally use this something. We would always round this. So this is 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. So I remember that was the number. We always used the letter C to denote the speed of light in our calculations. So, oh yeah, there it is. If you right here under Wikipedia. So we would always use the letter C to denote the speed of light in our calculations in engineering, and we would use 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, and whatever that is I don't know what that is in miles per hour or anything like that, but it's so fast that you can't even fathom how fast that is in a second. So then imagine if you take that speed and you say, look, how far is that in a year? Then that, if you multiply that speed by 1 year of seconds, then that gives you, again, trillions of miles. So this idea of a light year means that is the distance that light would travel in a year. So imagine that light travels, let me see if I can find the actual distance of a light year. It is light year. I need it in miles. Light year in miles is 5.879 times 10 to the 12th. So that would be 5.8 trillion miles. And again, it's very difficult to try to even to describe to you what a trillion is. But again, 5.8 trillion miles. So what I'm saying here is there are things that are farther away, not just than 5.8 trillion, but if you took 5.8 trillion and you multiplied that out by, let's say, 10,000, right? So that would be 50 quadrillion miles. There are things that are farther away than that we can observe light coming from them. Now, this creates a problem for believers in a sense, because if something is farther away than that, but we are saying that the earth is roughly 6,000 to 7,000 years old, but there's light coming from something that's more than 6,000 or 7,000 light years away, then that means that the light that we're seeing coming from that could not have already been in existence if we're saying that God created everything 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. So therefore, God is making things look like they're older than they are. So that's what would be considered the distant starlight problem. Now, Big Bang has problems of its own, but this is the distant starlight problem that you're saying if something is, let's say, 100,000 light years away, it's really, really far away. And if light travels at 30 million meters per second, that if light travels 30 million meters per second and this thing is 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 light years away, then they're going to say to me as a believer, Jerry, how can you believe that the earth is less than 10,000, 20,000, 50,000? It takes that long for that light to even get here. And you're saying that God created everything 6,000 years ago. Now, sometimes in the past, my answer to that would generally be something like, well, God could have created the light in such a way that when he made the star, let's say, that's producing that light, he could have at the very beginning created the light beam as well. Now, there are some people that will say, well, then God is doing things in such a way that he's purposely tricking us to think that the earth is older than it is. And those who would be old earth creationists, for instance, might say something, well, that means he's tricking us. He's showing it to be this age, but it's really not. What Dr. Lisle points out is that all of this is based on a faulty assumption. And the faulty assumption is that, well, not necessarily a faulty assumption, but it's a certain convention. The Einstein synchrony convention essentially says that the one direction, or the speed of light in one direction, is the same as the round trip speed. And what he says is that if you use a different convention, which is apparently scientifically viable, I have to go back and read his book again and try to maybe do a video on that. I don't know that anybody would be interested in that, but just I don't say that to say people wouldn't be interested, but it is one of those kind of astronomy topics that I don't really care that much about. But here's what I will say. His point is he has something called the anisotropic synchrony convention. And under that, because we don't know what the speed of light is in one direction, that you can have a convention in which you think of it as being an infinite speed, meaning that if light is traveling in one direction, it's instantaneous. Now, from a practical perspective, it is. Like for us, you turn the light on, there's no time it takes for the light to get to your eye. You see it immediately. So it's only with these vast distances that you have to then think about this. Dr. Lisle says it's possible to use a convention in which the speed of light is instantaneous in a single direction. And if you use that convention, then you understand quite well that, wait a minute, if you can use instantaneous, basically the time it takes for the light to get to your eye is actually instantaneous. When we look at those things that are many light years away, it's actually not that the light we're seeing is basically looking back in time, because that's what you would have to believe under the Einstein synchrony convention. He's saying you're not looking back in time. The light that we see didn't actually take thousands of years to get here. We're seeing the light as it's currently coming because it's coming in one direction. And that the time it takes to come in one direction is, well, instantaneous. Now, again, if you look this up, interestingly enough, he has this, there is an article about his, what he calls a solution to the distant starlight problem. But it's also interesting to look at people that don't that are opposed to this idea. So you have, basically an internal contradiction of his anisotropic synchrony convention. Rational wiki, these are generally that's like an atheistic wiki, and so they're probably, if we take a look at what they say here, they're probably saying, I'm not sure what they're going to say here. They say to get around the starlight problem, he proposes the speed of light in one direction is infinite, with the speed in the opposite direction being half its established value. Although counterintuitive and odd, this does have some basis in actual physics. Just as we could view the entire universe as if the Earth does not move, we could view special relativity as if there is one-way infinite light speed. So this is, it's again, one of the things they do, interestingly enough, point out here is that his convention is not falsifiable, meaning it's just as valid as the Einstein convention. And that's what he basically says in his articles. So that was a complete aside. I didn't even really want to get too much into that. But if you've never heard of this, it's an important idea, because it's tempting for us to use assumptions that actually might not be true, and they can lead us to then come up with explanations for things, like the one that naturally came to me, which is, well, God could have just made the starlight. He could have made the stars be hundreds of thousands of light years away, but then create the star and then also create the light beam from the star at the same time. And again, God could have done that. We have the account in Genesis saying that God made the stars on the fourth day. Yes, God could have done it that way. But if we're operating off of this Einstein synchrony convention, that assumes that we're looking back in time when we see starlight from that far away, the problem there is you don't have to use that convention. And that convention is not necessarily the correct one. It's just one that people use. And so Dr. Lisle says, hey, here's another convention that you could use that actually isn't falsifiable. You can it is a viable way to think about light, that in one direction it has infinite speed and light arrives instantly there. And it's not something you can go to from a physics perspective and say that he's wrong. Just like you can't really go to the Einstein convention and say it's right or it's wrong. It's just a convention from a physics perspective. It's an assumption that you're making essentially. So one of the things is, if you operate from the perspective of saying that you're looking back in time when you see these things that are vast different distances away, then you're going to come to what those who are secular essentially say, which is we're looking back in time. So therefore, these things that are so far away are not 6,000 or 7,000 years old. They're actually hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of years old. Because how else could we be seeing this light from that far distance? Because it takes the light this long to get there. What Dr. Lisle says is, no, the light doesn't take that long to get there. Now, he has a lot about that. I don't want to spend that much time on that. I want to spend more time talking about the predictions that he made. So here, if you go down and further in his article, he says here that they would expect that the JWST will show galaxies in the earliest stages of formation. So again, they believe that the light we're seeing from these distant galaxies is essentially us looking back in time, because the light we are currently seeing was emitted tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and we're just now seeing it because we're so far away from it. That's what they believe. And so if they believe that, and they believe in this Big Bang hypothesis, then they're going to expect that the light that we're seeing from those galaxies is from a long time ago, and that those galaxies were initially being formed. So what we're going to see is those galaxies in those early stages of formation. That's what we should see. We should see stars that are in the process of formation and in the process of assembling into galaxies. That is the hypothesis that they would expect based on that view. The other thing that they're going to expect is that the nature of those stars that they see are going to be stars that don't have these heavy elements in them. And the reason why they wouldn't have these heavy elements in them, he says here, is that the Big Bang cannot produce such elements, even in principle. And so secular scientists believe that such elements would completely be absent in the first generation of stars. So they're expecting that when they see these stars in these distant galaxies, they're not going to have any heavy elements in them, nothing heavier than lithium. Okay. If we're thinking about what creationists would expect to find, and he's saying, look, I'm not speaking for everybody, but if we're looking at what creationists would expect to find, we would find something completely different. And so he's saying, no, I think when we look, we're going to find fully formed galaxies. So those are two completely different predictions. One group of people are saying what we find from this JWST is we're going to find brand new galaxies being formed. Those who believe in creation are going to say, no, we're going to see fully formed galaxies out there. So it's going to be one way or the other. Either you're going to see nothing but new galaxies being formed, or you're going to see fully formed galaxies. Those are two separate expectations based on two separate worldviews. So, hey, which one are we going to see? Then he says, I expect that we will see heavy elements in those galaxies. So we're not just going to see these stars or and elements that have nothing heavier than lithium. Because Dr. Lisle is saying, I expect to see fully formed everything wherever we look in the cosmos, wherever we look in all of these other galaxies. God made everything mature. So I don't expect to see anything just now being formed, because I don't believe we're actually looking back in time. I believe the light is getting here. What we are seeing from those distant galaxies is what is currently happening in those distant galaxies, and they are fully formed, mature galaxies. So these are a couple of the predictions that he made. Now, what he also says here, because he doesn't believe in Big Bang cosmology, one of the things that he says is that they're going to try to move the goalpost by now changing the expectation, right? They're going to have these certain expectations that are based on Big Bang cosmology. And what he says here in January of 2022 is that when you look back, when they get this, when they see things that they don't turn out the way they expect, they're going to turn around and they're going to move the goalpost. And so he says that these planets that are going to be found, he believed, would change some of their secular theories, but they're not going to really change the ultimate idea that there was a Big Bang several billion years ago. And so he says here that that he's expecting that the goalpost is going to be moved. And that's what he says in this article from January of 2022. So if you then go to his article from September of 2022, he begins to talk about some of the preliminary findings. And as we just mentioned, one of the expectations was that there would be, that if you looked at these galaxies that are really, really far away, the expectation would be that they would be these newly formed galaxies rather than fully formed galaxies. And so here he's talking about in the later article that there would be fully formed galaxies at unprecedented distances, and that it would force astronomers to adjust their estimates, that they would start saying, oh, well, the earliest galaxies formed longer ago than we previously thought. And so he says, he even says here, Webb discovers that galaxies formed much earlier than previously thought, might be a headline that would come out of the findings that were found. So sure enough, this is exactly what happened. What they found was there weren't any new galaxies that they found being formed. And so there's an author that had an article, and the article says, if the finding is confirmed, it would be one of the earliest galaxies ever observed, and its presence would indicate that galaxies started forming much earlier than many astronomers previously thought. Another article said, massive galaxies formed earlier than the universe than previously known. Now, this is very similar to what he said that they would say, right? He's saying, I'm telling you that you're not going to find the thing that they thought they would find. And this is what they're going to say when they don't find the thing that they thought they would find. So this is one of those expectations that turns out to be, it didn't happen the way the secularist thought it should happen, but the creationist who said, no, God made everything, and the light you're seeing is not looking back in time, his expectation actually is what is found by the evidence from the space telescope. The next thing was the mass and structures of these galaxies. Basically, are these new galaxies being formed, or are they fully mature galaxies that are not these small, low mass, clumpy, irregular galaxies? Well, in a Washington Post article that he quotes here, he says, the first scientific results have emerged in recent weeks, and what the telescope has seen in deepest space is a little puzzling. Some of those distant galaxies are strikingly massive. A general assumption had been that early galaxies, which formed not long after the first stars ignited, would be relatively small and misshapen. Instead, some of them are big, bright, and nicely structured. Now, again, the fundamental assumption is that we're looking back in time, and we're looking so far back in time when we see this stuff from the telescope that it's got to be stuff from earlier. It's got to be galaxies that haven't fully formed yet. But what if that assumption is wrong? And what Dr. Lisle says is it is wrong. It's not that we're looking back in time. We're seeing things as they currently are. And so this isn't, so this Big Bang cosmology is is not to be assailed, right? This is the thing about all of this, that everything they're going to find, they're not ever going to question the Big Bang cosmology. They're going to hold on to it, even if all of the evidence points to something that could be that would be more of an alternative perspective. So one of the things he says, in other words, the most distant galaxies are fully formed, just as creationists expected to find. They do not show any evidence of the gradual mass accumulation and evolution that the secularists predicted. The article continues with a quote from astronomer Garth Illingworth, who states, "The models just don't predict this." Regarding the large mass of these distant galaxies, Illingworth states, "How do you do this in the universe at such an early time? How do you form so many stars so quickly?" Well, you don't, is what Dr. Lisle says. And a Big Bang can't, but God can and did. So what he points out is that believing in a creator who made these things leads him to real, testable, falsifiable predictions that he made. And guess what? The predictions that he made based on a creationist cosmology actually are what they found. But these people aren't going to go along with that cosmology because, again, it is anathema to them. They cannot go along with it. So there was one other aspect to this, and it was the idea of finding, are they going to find heavy elements or are they going to find these light elements? And what he said is, well, as a creationist, he recognized that heavy elements were going to exist. And so he expected that they would see heavy elements out there, things that were not as we saw earlier, that the lithium, which is one of the lightest elements, they were expecting to find nothing much heavier than that. So the Big Bang supporters are saying that we're only going to see stars that have hydrogen, helium, and lithium, no heavy elements. So what did the telescope find? Well, according to Dr. Lisle, there's a research team led by physicist Jonathan Trump who analyzed the spectra of certain high redshift galaxies in the JWST data. This physicist states, the universe started out with only hydrogen and helium, and every other element on the periodic table is slowly produced by nuclear fusion in stars and distributed by supernovae over the 13.7 billion years from the Big Bang to the current time. Our new paper finds that infant galaxies are surprisingly enriched by oxygen and other non-primordial elements, suggesting highly efficient stellar fusion and explosions in the early universe. What he's essentially saying here is, well, we actually found heavier elements. We only expected to find hydrogen, helium, and lithium. Now, notice, or maybe just hydrogen, helium, and then those can combine to form lithium, because if you remember from your chemistry in high school, hydrogen has one proton, I believe. Helium has two, lithium has three. So you put hydrogen and helium together, and I believe you can form lithium, is how they would have expected it to work. But they found oxygen, which is, I believe, 6 or 8 on the periodic table is oxygen. I think it's maybe 8. Let's see. Let's see if I can find this. If we're looking at a periodic table of elements, yeah, oxygen is 8. So you can see it on the periodic table. And so hydrogen is 1, helium is 2, lithium is 3 on the periodic table. So these are the 3 lightest elements, and oxygen is 8 on the periodic table, right? So it would be considered heavier for these people. And so these secular scientists can't understand, well, how can these things be? And so what do? Whatever the timeline was, they just push it back farther. Well, then they just simply say, hey, it just happened earlier than we previously thought. They don't say, well, this didn't happen the way we expected, so maybe we should rethink our cosmological model. They're not going to do that. What they're going to do is just simply, as Dr. Lisle would put it, push the goalpost farther back. Now, if you point out these things, right, there are all of these surprises. They are using terms like surprisingly enriched by oxygen, surprising richness of elements, So you're seeing this, we're going to have to rethink the speed at which star formation occurs. What happens is they thought it was a certain way, and these thoughts are based on a certain worldview. These thoughts are based on the Big Bang cosmology, and then what they're finding isn't that. Now, I'm not saying that they should just from these findings throw out Big Bang altogether, but it is just another piece of evidence that points to something other than whatever they were predicting. Whereas you have someone who believes that the Earth is roughly a few thousand years old, who has these predictions, and it's what his predictions are spot on. So if you come down to his conclusion, he says something that's interesting here, and that's where we're going to end today's podcast episode. I actually just want to read through most of what he these first three paragraphs that he has in his conclusion. Dr. Lisle says, it is always exciting to see creation predictions confirmed and secular predictions refuted by data. The ability to make correct, specific predictions is a key characteristic of a good scientific model. So perhaps the current creationist understanding of cosmology is on the right track. We have a tremendous advantage because we build our models on the infallible Word of God. This doesn't ensure that the details of our models are always correct, since such details go beyond the text of Scripture and in many cases are educated guesses, but it does allow us to eliminate many false leads, those that are contrary to Genesis. So what he says here in this first part is that he had real predictions, real science predictions that were confirmed, and the secular predictions weren't. So again, he has receipts here. You go to January 2022, and he says, this is what I, as a creationist, expect. These who are secular people expect this. What are we going to find? I think it's this. They think it's this. I think it's this way because I am a believer in the Bible and what I see in the world. They think it's this way. They do not believe that. They believe in the Big Bang cosmology and these different things. Whose predictions come true? It's not the secularist. It's the person who's the creationist. Now, you could say that's just luck, but again, if they are correct on all of these other things, then what they were predicting is a natural would have been a natural byproduct, but it's not what was seen. So he says here, hey, maybe we're on the right track. It doesn't mean that just because he's a creationist that all the details of his models are right, because that's not the point. Of course, he's not going to be right about all of it. That's what science is, that you're trying to figure it out. But he's at least building on the Word of God, which is right. And if he wasn't doing that, then you're going to much more easily go into false directions. For example, it is a false lead in a different realm to say that we need to go to Mars. It's a false lead. If you understand that the Earth was made for humans and that humans were made on the Earth, then going to Mars isn't going to work. So when you understand that, then you can reject these ideas that aren't based on the Word of God, and you don't go down these false leads. And this is what he's pointing to here. A lot of these things that were predicted were false leads that he could have easily said, well, no, there aren't these. We aren't looking back in time. We aren't looking at something that's going to be newly formed. We're not going to see only light elements. We're going to see heavy elements too. He was basing the things that he was saying on a biblical worldview. He then says in the second paragraph of his conclusion, I would like to make an additional prediction, not about the astronomy, but about the secularists' reaction to all these exciting new discoveries. The Bible not only gives accurate information about the universe, it also gives accurate information about people. Apart from the regenerating power of the Holy Spirit, the Bible says that people love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. John chapter 3, verses 19 and 20. The Bible teaches that all people know God and that they are hardwired to recognize creation as his handiwork. Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. Yet they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Verse 18 of Romans 1. People would rather believe a lie than accept the truth about creation. Therefore, I predict that the secular community as a whole will not be moved by these amazing results from the James Webb Space Telescope. Despite all evidence to the contrary, they will continue to believe in a Big Bang and that stars and galaxies spontaneously formed over millions of years. They will simply push these stories to a much earlier time so that they are beyond verification or falsification by our current technological limits. They will not give up the Big Bang or evolution, no matter what evidence is found. This confirms that the Big Bang is not really science at all, but a philosophical pre-commitment in light of what secularists interpret, of which secularists interpret all data. This is important because the very thing that sometimes believers get accused of, who are scientists, is exactly what's happening here. Believers get accused of saying you're just going to take the Bible and you're not going to all of the scientific things that you believe, you're never going to actually test them. Nothing that you do is falsifiable. But it's actually the opposite. It is those who believe in things like Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution, who trust in that, and anything that they look at, any evidence that they find that goes against it, it does not matter. They simply reinterpret it in the light of the thing that they already believe. They will not give up these ideas. Now, maybe you're watching this, maybe you're listening to this and you see this and you say, hey, I just want to go the direction that the evidence leads. If you do that, it's going to lead you away from stuff like Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution, because these are not science ideas. They are philosophical pre-commitments, is the way that Dr. Lisle would put it. And so they are going to start with that and then interpret the data that way. It is not that you look at the data and find Big Bang there. It is that they want to believe a Big Bang. Because if you believe a Big Bang, then you do not have to believe in a God. If you believe in abiogenesis, you do not believe in a life giver. If you believe in evolution, you do not believe in someone who is a designer of human life and of the biological systems that we see in the world. So there are implications to recognizing that God made these things, and people just don't want to go along with those implications. So it's really interesting to look at this. Again, astronomy is not really my strong suit, but it's really interesting to see real scientific predictions being made by someone who's a creationist, and then those come true. The secularist, he makes his predictions, none of them come true, and he holds on to Big Bang. He holds on to this cosmic evolutionary model that these stars just kind of come into being and just happen to be the way that they are. That's it for today's show. We see real science being done by someone who believes in the Bible and believes in the accounts from the book of Genesis and doesn't compromise on those and looks to try to figure out how we can understand the world better. And so that's real science being done here. And we saw this in the case of some of Dr. Lisle's work. Again, I'll link all of the two articles from him and the video of his talk in the description. But if I also don't do this quite enough, but if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please do that. Like the video, share it, and we are going to continue to produce content where we are showing the integration of science with faith. It is not that we're saying that we need these things to believe, but we are going to expect that the science that true science being done, true scientific concepts will confirm the faith that we already have. And so that's what we are seeing certainly in this case. That's it for today's show. Till next time, keep asking questions, keep the faith.